Something is happening in the war right now. It is hard to dispute that there has been a fundamental change along the line of control, and that immediately raises questions about how the Kremlin will internalize what is happening and change course one way or another, especially as it relates to an agreement that could bring the war to a close. So, on today's edition of the Geopolitics Helpline, a viewer asks, when exactly will the Kremlin come to terms with the real situation? We oftentimes talk about how settlements need to be commensurate with the balance of power between two states. If we assume for a second that Russia can't meet its own internal expectations, what would need to happen for the Kremlin to honestly/genuinely self-assess that giving up any further claims to the Donbass is in line with the actual balance of power? How do Kremlin delusions of grandeur become revised Kremlin assessments of self-weakness? Also, go Tritons! Okay, let me start with a bit of background to play up the importance of this question. There are three primary obstacles that people thought are prolonging the war, at least as of a few months ago. 1. Putin's political fears about what will happen at home after the war ends. 2. Ukraine's defensive ability to sustain a settlement commensurate with the expected military outcome. And 3. Disagreement between the parties regarding how the war will play out. I have spent plenty of time explaining why the standard belief that Putin will immediately and obviously lose power once the war ends is wrong. To avoid repeating myself too much, the economic situation for the average Russian is fine, and the post-war economic hangover can be managed by slowly weaning off elevated government spending. However, continuing to pursue the war carries with it serious threats of a coup, as the situation brings further punishment to the oligarch class. Hence, the political incentives are to settle, not to continue. Possibility 2 has seen some critical developments over the last few months. As you can see here, Ukraine has started to gain ground. That trend has continued over the last 4 weeks, with Ukraine picking up another 179 square kilometers, or 69 square miles. It is a nice total for Kyiv, though it is far from a pathway to restoring the 2021 borders. But if this implies that the expected outcome of war is close to the current line of control, then we have avoided the domino problem where conceding territory commensurate with Russia's expected gains disables Ukrainian defenses, thereby extending those Russian expected gains. So with no dominoes and few domestic concerns, that leaves a disagreement in the expected outcome as the best plausible explanation for the war's continuation. And that is why this question is super relevant. But before we get to the answer, I need to underscore something that the viewer wisely added to the question. If we assume for a second that Russia can't meet its own internal expectations, if we assume, that is the key bit. This is not just a point about us as keyboard warriors needing to be cautious about claiming that we know things, especially things about intelligence, when all we literally have access to is open source information. Generally speaking, it is usually true that if something is obvious to every Chris and Christine out there from Pittsburgh to Paris, then it should be obvious to the actual parties involved. In turn, we cannot know private information. Definitionally, it is no longer private at that point. This is a problem that goes well beyond informed war watchers. I think there is a general bias for average people to think that their side is right and the other side is wrong. I mean this in both a false optimism sense and the notion that the morally right side is destined to emerge victorious. Both of these biases have been painfully apparent with the Ukraine war narratives, especially among the "Putin is done" crowd. And while I am happy to live in a world where Germany did not win World War II, being morally right has unfortunately little impact on who lives and who dies. When I first started learning crisis bargaining theory, the uncertainty over power explanation for war was especially eye-opening for me. It is predicated on someone being wrong. Ever since then, whenever I have seen the other side refuse to back down in a crisis, I engage in a moment of self-reflection that maybe we are the ones who are over-optimistic. But let's go ahead and assume that the Kremlin is wrong. It is a fair possibility, even if we cannot know for sure. Given that, we should still work through the implications of when Moscow will recognize the reality of the situation. Well, let me explore a few different ways this might go. 1. The underlying problem is just a simple disagreement over how the battle space operates. Then the answer is simple enough. Ukraine accumulates a bunch of victories, Russia has the physical evidence that its assessments are wrong, and then we move on. 2. If it is a disagreement over long-run Western support, we run into a problem of how the medium run provides no direct evidence of Western commitment. Lots of running going on here. You may recall that this conundrum inspired my self-respecting academic alter ego to write a paper on that subject. One of the things that I did not mention in the video on the subject is the following result. Suppose that it takes N years for there to be a difference in battlefield outcomes based on possible types of worlds that we live in. Here, that is useful long-run Western support versus eventual Western abandonment. Then, conditional on a war starting, there is positive probability that the war goes on for at least N years. That is a technical way of saying that we could be here for a while. The final case worth working through is when information about battlefield realities does not filter up to Putin. We have a template for what this might look like. It is the short version of how the war started in the first place. The incentive structure within Russia's autocracy did not reward accurate news reaching Putin's desk. It only rewarded good news. Hence Putin's over-optimism. You can spend 40 minutes learning the details by watching this video if you want the finer details. I also wrote an academic paper on the subject. Hooray, more peer review. Oh wait, no, that was my academic alter ego. I'm sorry. But it is a rare example where it is possible that open source analysts can somewhat accurately anticipate an information problem, though that still makes a heroic assumption that we understand the inner workings of the Kremlin's current intelligence distribution. I think that it is worth noting that Russia resolved the proximate problem that caused the war, which is what led to the withdrawal from Western Ukraine, and eventually the plotting advance in Eastern Ukraine. Nonetheless, there is a tempting way to fall victim to the amateur's fallacy here. The fix was ad hoc, not a fix to the overall incentive structure within Russia. And why would there be? Retaining control over the Kremlin will always be a greater priority than whatever is happening in Ukraine. Moreover, Putin himself was aware of the sycophantic incentives that his autocratic institutions created. It is a natural byproduct of consolidating power. Fixing the underlying problem was never in consideration. Thus, it is perfectly plausible to think that the Kremlin is ripe to suffer the same problem as before. That being the case, there are two important things to keep in mind here. 1. It might take Putin a long time to realize what is happening. Purposefully inflated intelligence assessments can only be inflated so much. That is why the whole house of cards collapsed back in the spring of 2022. Eventually, there was no way to square Putin's expectations with what was happening on the ground, which led to the change in strategy. What that means for us today is that Ukraine might need to freeze the front line or push it east for an extended period of time before Putin internalizes that the war has fundamentally changed again. Second, there is a self-reinforcing problem with Putin learning that new information. As the war has progressed, Putin has become more concerned that someone or some group will remove him from power, hence his frequent and extended trips away from Moscow. If the war gets worse, those threats will increase. But then Putin further isolates himself, making it more difficult for an enterprising individual to break the bad news to him. So Putin has to pull further back, which makes it even more difficult for another enterprising individual to provide an accurate update. Aren't incentives in autocratic regimes perverse? Meanwhile, if you want to get further into the perversion, mind you, safer work perversion, then you can check out my aforementioned documentary on Putin's information problem. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.